Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, December 28th, 2023, and as we get into the new year, today we are going to be talking about the 2024 Senate elections that are set to take place in just under 11 months now. With Senator Joe Manchin retiring from the state of West Virginia back in November, a lot of questions have been raised about whether or not the Democratic Party can reasonably win back control of the United States Senate come next year's election. And for a bit more background context, the 2024 Senate races are probably the least beneficial to Democrats that they have experienced in the past 3 election cycles. This Senate map is extremely conducive to a Republican victory, and the Democratic Party's 1-seat majority doesn't exactly put them in good standing for the 2024 Senate races. As I've been making in videos prior to this one, I have said consistently that the Republican Party are the favorites to win back Senate control in next year's elections. But keep in mind, my December prediction back in December of 2021 for the 2022 midterm elections had Republicans handedly winning back control of the U.S. Senate with a 53-47 advantage, which ultimately ended up being not true. But to explain a little bit more, this isn't the 2022 midterm elections. There is a presidential election coinciding with many of the Senate elections. And on that note, we find that if you were to apply the 2020 presidential election results to the upcoming Senate elections, Democrats would in fact lose control of the Senate 52-48. And that's because Democrats currently have Democratic senators in a bunch of red states. States like Montana, Ohio, West Virginia, where Democrats have been defending these seats since 2006. Joe Manchin, the Democrat retiring from West Virginia, leaving this seat open gives Republicans an automatic pickup. Democrats are currently only contesting 2 Donald Trump 2020 states in Montana and Ohio very heavily, and are fundraising and putting efforts down into Texas. But beyond that, the remaining states here are quite Republican. They probably are not going to see any substantial Democratic challenger enter themselves into the fray because almost everybody knows they are going to go red. And the problem with this coinciding with the presidential election is that depending on how the presidential election goes, Democrats could end up doing a lot more poorly than the 2020 presidential map. Here's the same exact Senate map with the 2016 election results applied. Republicans would win back Senate control with a whopping 56 seats, with pickups in Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and Montana. And so this is where Republicans get very worried. Because the 2024 presidential election isn't exactly shaping up to where it needs to be for Joe Biden going into the new year, Democrats are worried that they could lose Senate control. And worried they should be. Even if we were to stand with the 2020 election results, this 52-48 map would make it nearly impossible for Democrats to win back Senate control through the remainder of the decade. Because the 2026 Senate maps aren't exactly to bode super well if Democrats do win back the presidency or maintain control of the White House, or if they lose it even with the Donald Trump midterm, it's still going to be difficult given the map that is set up to take place just 2 years down the line. So the 2024 Senate map here is extremely important for Democrats, and they're looking at it as an opportunity to maintain Senate control. But the pathway certainly is not easy. So in this video, we're going to be talking about how Democrats could reasonably maintain control of the U.S. Senate despite a Senate map that is so heavily lopsided in favor of the GOP. Even at the initial base, Republicans have 38 seats that currently are uncontested, meaning they are not up in the 2024 Senate maps, which means that they are safe for the GOP. The Democrats have 28 seats compared to the Republicans' 38, which means we have about 34 races that are currently labeled as toss-up. Obviously, they're not all toss-ups. Nebraska also has a special election, which is another Republican-safe state. So we're working with very few toss-up states. So to begin, we're going to have to characterize all of the states that Republicans are essentially going to win. There's no contesting that they are going to win in the state of West Virginia. I think Democrats were hopeful that if Joe Manchin decided to ride it out and run for one more term, maybe they could make a competitive. Realistically, that just simply wasn't going to happen. Jim Justice, the Republican governor, is running in that state, so there was no shot the Democrats were going to be able to win there, even with somebody like Joe Manchin. But as we characterize these states, we start to see that our Senate map really does narrow down to around 9 total toss-up states: Montana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, Texas, Arizona, and Nevada. And reasonably speaking, Florida isn't going to be very competitive in 2024, especially on a presidential ballot where we are widely expecting President Donald Trump to win the state of Florida. So that brings us down to 8 actual states that probably are going to be narrower than potentially 5 points in the upcoming election because they are coinciding with a presidential ballot. And so when we look at these states, we have to understand the Democrats are absolutely going to be going all out for these main 8. They're going to be spending over $100 million, probably even more. The 2024 election cycle is estimated to cost $10 billion in terms of advertisement spending across both sides of the aisle. So you're looking at roughly each party spending about $5 billion on the races here. So I imagine actually it will exceed $100 million. I don't know if you remember back in 2020, Democrats spent $100 million in South Carolina. They spent $100 million in Maine. They spent $100 million practically everywhere. And in many cases, all of it ended up with nothing for Democrats, with them losing a bunch of these Senate races. But money absolutely does speak. And Democrats and Republicans both will be spending exorbitant amounts of money on these important races because they are going to determine the future not only of just this upcoming Congress, but likely future ones, depending on what Democrats are able to build up or Republicans are able to tear down. And so looking at these 8 states, we have to start off with the assumption that all of them are going to be competitive on the presidential level, taking out the state of Montana. Ohio and Texas, we generally know how they're going to go, but they're still going to be decided probably by less than 10 points in this upcoming election cycle, which means if it's competitive on the presidential, it's probably competitive down ballot. A lot of the congressional races we will see, even ones down to narrow House districts, will also be very competitive. If Joe Biden and Donald Trump are within a point of each other in a congressional district, chances are, because people vote practically how they do on the presidential all the way down through the ballot, chances are those congressional candidates will be as well. But this down ballot effect actually benefits Republicans more in 2024 than it does Democrats. Again, feeding into this idea and understanding that the 2024 Senate map is lopsided in favor of the GOP. They are the victors of this race at the bare minimum, right? They are the ones who are able to win this race, even if they just exert a little bit of effort in Montana and Ohio. You think about this from the perspective of Democrats being competitive in states where Trump won by 8 in 2020. Trump won by 16 in 2020. If Democrats are able to win here, it will be a complete collapse for the GOP because there should be no reality in which Democrats do maintain Senate control. But here we are exploring that because as we saw in 2022, Republicans absolutely can fall from the graces of victory very easily and very swiftly, despite anybody expecting otherwise. And so looking at our 8 states, we can say, if we are working with a map where Democrats are winning back control of the U.S. Senate, they need to win the big 3 in the Rust Belt: Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And there are chances that they do this. They have an incumbent in Pennsylvania, Bob Casey, and Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin. Michigan is the only one that's a bit interesting because there's a retiring incumbent. Fortunately for Democrats, Michigan just so happens to be the most Democratic state out of the 3. In 2016, Hillary Clinton lost the state by the narrowest margin, and in 2020, Joe Biden won the state by the largest margin of the 3. It also helps that in 2018 and 2022, Democrats won the governor's races there and the Senate races there by larger margins than they did in any of the other surrounding states. So Michigan, because there is a retiring incumbent there, definitely deserves a bit more attention, a bit more scrutiny when it comes down to how we predict it. But generally speaking, especially in a circumstance like this, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania have to go blue. So that brings the Democrats up to 46, but Republicans are at a baseline 49. All they need under a Donald Trump presidency is 1 more seat, and under a Joe Biden presidency, 2 more. Out of the remaining 5, that's not exactly meaning they have to go 50-50 with Democrats. And so 46 to 49 puts Democrats in a tricky position. Where do they go next? Well, if we're being entirely honest, Democrats probably are not winning the state of Texas. And so with this circumstance, that would require Democrats to maintain control of the U.S. Senate via a presidential election. The only other reality in which we actually see Democrats maintaining control of the U.S. Senate under a Donald Trump presidency is in a scenario in which they win the state of Texas. So let's move this back to the toss-up column. Let's talk about what it will take for Democrats to win in some of these seats. On an individual basis, Montana is going to be probably the most competitive out of the entire group. It is going to be one of the hardest states for Democrats to win, even harder than Ohio, and in some people's perspective, even harder than Texas. The different thing here, though, is that Montana, some people as well, could also be easier to win because there is a popular incumbent, Jon Tester, who has been tried and tested, no pun intended there, tested in 2006, 2012, and 2018, despite Donald Trump winning the state by over 20 points prior to his reelection in 2018, against now who is one of the representatives in the state. So in terms of individual circumstances, let's start with some of the easier states where we can make a bigger rationale and a better rationale to how Democrats could win. So we'll start off with the state of Nevada, where Democrats are currently set to renominate Jackie Rosen to the Democratic primary here, who has received the endorsement and the support of many national Democrats. There really is no reason that she would receive any primary challenge, and realistically speaking, there will probably be only her name and a no-name Democrat, on the ballot in the primary. But on the Republican side, things are a little bit less sorted out. When you take a look at the GOP bench, there actually isn't much of one. That's because Democrats have practically demolished the Republican Party in Nevada despite it being a very competitive state. The only person I could imagine that could maybe make the jump very quickly is the incumbent governor right now, Jim Lombardo, but that probably isn't going to happen. Joe Lombardo, not Jim. It's not exactly normal for a governor to go from a governor's race to a Senate race. Kari Lake is trying to do it in Arizona, but obviously she didn't win her race, so it's a bit different of a circumstance. That isn't going to happen. And so of the declared candidates here, you have Sam Brown, who ran for Senate back in 2022, I believe came in third place in that primary. You have Jim Merchant, who currently serves and also ran for Secretary of State in 2022. His election was actually quite competitive, but not as much as it should have been. When you look at the Secretary of State election, considering that the Democrats lost the governorship, a lot of these races down ballot should have gone to the GOP. He actually had one of the worst performing margins for the GOP, but still came within about 2 points. So he still is in somewhat competitive territory, but there's a reason he underperformed a lot of the top line Republicans there. But when you look, a lot of them are really going back and forth. The polling here seems to suggest that Sam Brown is probably going to be the nominee, but based on his endorsements and based on his previous stances, is not exactly a super strong candidate. Outside of being a U.S. Army veteran, he doesn't have political experience to bring to the arena, and he certainly doesn't have the backing of a very, very big political dynasty like somebody like Adam Laxalt did in the last election, who still ended up losing to somebody like Jackie Rosen. Except in that case, it was Catherine Cortez Masto. And so when we look to the general election, almost all the ratings here are saying that it's lean D or tilt D. Despite the competitive nature of the upcoming election, Jackie Rosen is still polling ahead by 5 points, according to even a Republican pollster. So you can start to see the idea here that Nevada realistically could go blue, even in a circumstance where Biden is losing the presidential election. Now, the next state I would say is most likely to go blue is the state of Arizona. And that might strike some people as surprising, considering that Kyrsten Sinema, we yet to have seen what her plans are for 2024, but might be a third-party candidate on this ballot. And so what we know about this race so far is that the Democratic Party is set to nominate Ruben Gallego. He is very much going to be the frontrunner here, has been for a while, has openly floated the idea of primarying Kyrsten Sinema, challenged her initially before she switched her party over to independent, which a lot of people speculate is the reason why she's an independent now, but for all intents and purposes has been this Democratic nominee for practically a year and a half now. On the Republican side, it's a little bit more tricky, but we have a general idea of where it's going to go as well. Kari Lake, the candidate from 2022 who lost the governorship, is polling very high. She's on track to win the Senate race, and Donald Trump just endorsed her again for the primary, and chances are she will receive the nomination and head on into the general election. Now, a lot of the predictions here are toss-ups, largely because the Democratic Party, the Republican Party may not be the only ones on the ballot, right? Kyrsten Sinema very well could pop out here and make this race more competitive. The interesting thing about this, though, is that in a lot of recent polling data, Ruben Gallego still defeats Kari Lake. Despite the ones taken by Republican pollsters here, the nonpartisan pollsters here, and even some Republican ones, Ruben Gallego does pull out ahead of Kari Lake. And that's largely because Kari Lake is just so unpopular. Voters in the state of Arizona simply don't like her because they rejected her 2 years ago. And so for her to return after denying the results of the election, trying to run for United States Senate, it doesn't exactly bode well amongst the general electorate. It especially gets worse when it comes down to head-to-head races between Ruben Gallego and Kari Lake. In a circumstance in which you do not see Kari Lake, Kyrsten Sinema, and Ruben Gallego on the ballot, you just see the one-to-one matchup. I don't know if they have it here. We don't have the polling. Let's see. I don't know if there's a reason why they haven't populated it here. Kyrsten Sinema has yet to declare that she's running. But in almost every single matchup, you find that Ruben Gallego defeats Kari Lake. And again, that's because losing candidates typically don't go on to win just 2 years later. That also coincided with the fact that Arizona has an abortion referendum on the ballot in 2024 that will inevitably help Democrats and probably pass given the partisan composition of Arizona. So that brings Democrats to 48. Republicans are at 49. Where is their pathway forward? Well, obviously, they need to win all these remaining states in a Trump presidency. We already said that if Biden was reelected, it'd probably be Montana and Ohio and not Texas. And so the reason why we see that happening is because Texas, although Ted Cruz had a very competitive race, we can talk about it very briefly, I don't think it deserves too much attention because the circumstance in which Democrats winning there would take a lot more than it did in 2018 is largely because Ted Cruz in 2018 lost a lot of support relative to his 2012 election. In 2012, Ted Cruz got 6.5% of the vote in this race, actually doing very similarly to where Mitt Romney was on the presidential ballot, but 6 years later became one of the nation's most unpopular senators and nearly lost the state, lost over 10 points in terms of support and came within 3 points of losing to what at some point in time was a no-name congressman from the state of Texas who came from the El Paso region, who ran for Senate largely seen as a sacrificial lamb, came in within 3 points of defeating Ted Cruz, the runner-up of the 2016 Republican primary. And so that put Texas on the radar for many national Republicans and Democrats. It started to be back into this conversation, could Democrats actually win the state of Texas? And realistically speaking, it is possible, but again, it would take a lot, and Beto O'Rourke is certainly not back on this ballot. Right now, Democrats are running Colin Allred, a U.S. representative. They also have other possibilities here, but Colin Allred has been pulling in major endorsements across the country, a lot of support from the Texas delegation, and based off fundraising numbers, has been out fundraising all of his Democratic opponents quite significantly, polling very far ahead. And so in a circumstance in which he does win, again, it will take a lot. He's not polling super well, and the general election predictions here are that this is a likely red state. But again, Democrats need this for a majority that expands beyond, potentially having a Biden re-election. It could happen, only because in 2018, the numbers were looking the exact same. Beto O'Rourke was down 9 to 12 points, depending on the polling source you were looking at. All of the predictions here had Texas as a likely red state. Come election day, boom, it's a 3-point margin. And so maybe in some, strange circumstance here, Texas could go blue, and we'll get back to that and characterize it after we talk about Montana and Ohio, but that is really the only way the Democrats could realistically win back Senate control, regardless of who's in the presidential spot. So moving over to the state of Montana and Ohio, I would say Ohio is a bit more easier to win, especially now with recent developments in the GOP primary. Donald Trump endorsed probably the worst candidate here for the GOP primary, Bernie Moreno, who doesn't have political experience to his name, competing against Matt Dolan, who's a state senator from the state, Frank LaRose, who currently serves in a statewide elected position as Ohio Secretary of State. But Donald Trump's endorsement practically supersedes all. You can see that in recent polling data, Bernie Moreno has taken a lead. He went from somebody who was at 6, 7, 9% now to 20%, 23%, 22%. He's doing quite well. In terms of fundraising, he's also on pace to match Matt Dolan, to match Frank LaRose, in fact, do better than the Secretary of State of Ohio. He's making a name for himself. And with this Donald Trump endorsement, as he heads into the general election, he actually makes this race more competitive because, quite frankly, he is the weakest GOP nominee. Sherrod Brown just so happens to be the strongest Democrat that I think is up in these Donald Trump states. You look at Sherrod Brown in 2018, he won by 6 points. 2012, he won by an even larger margin, right? When you take a look at the Sherrod Brown-Bernie Moreno matchup, which is likely what this is going to be, in not a single instance is Sherrod Brown losing to Bernie Moreno. The same cannot be said if he's faced up against Matt Dolan or Frank LaRose, where in multiple instances, he's either tied or losing to the GOP nominee. But in this case, the likeliest case, he actually ends up winning. And so Ohio right now could realistically go blue. You find that Democrats would be raised up all the way to 49. Now, under a Biden presidency, again, it would take 1. Under a Trump presidency, it would take 2. And so we visit the state of Montana yet again as the final state that we're going to be talking about in depth, because Jon Tester is the last Democrat who really needs to win in this Biden reelect. And so Jon Tester, who won his first race in 2006, won re-election in 2012. That was coinciding with the presidential ballot. That took a lot. Certainly took a lot. It was a very narrow race. Then 2018, he had to outrun Donald Trump being heavily involved in this state and impacting this state because of his 2016 decisive victory across the state. He had to face off a lot of competition in 2018. In 2024, coincidentally, he might be able to face up against the same exact candidate that Republicans nominated in 2018. The national GOP wants to surround themselves around Tim Sheehy, who is a retired Navy SEAL and is pretty much a businessman well known across the state of Montana. He's been getting a lot of attention on Fox News, on conservative media areas. He's been getting a lot of support from national GOP figures, a lot of U.S. senators, a lot of support, including the incumbent governor of the state. They're calling in the cavalry here because Matt Rosendale, who wants to run for this Senate seat, the incumbent U.S. representative from Montana's 2nd district, already lost the seat. And so this is a warning sign for Republicans in a very similar way we saw in 2022, where nominating the wrong candidate could make them lose the election. And that's the exact circumstance that Democrats would need in 2024, a Rosendale-Tester rematch that could replicate the results similar to 2018. Because Democrats in Montana have outran the presidential ballot, especially in circumstances when Donald Trump was on the ballot. In 2020, Steve Bullock outran the presidential margin by 6 to 7 points, but more impressively in 2016, when he was running for governor as an incumbent, he outran Donald Trump by around 20 points, outran Hillary Clinton rather, by around 20 points. So he did very well Despite Donald Trump on the presidential ballot doing extremely well in the state of Montana, contrary to Mitt Romney, and especially much better than John McCain did in the state. And so Montana, we could see a reality in which Jon Tester does win the state, which would give the Democrats the majority and a Biden reelect. And if Colin Allred was able to pull it out in the state of Texas, would give Democrats the majority in a Trump election. And so what we know from this is that we had to go through many, many scenarios and circumstances to give Democrats this majority. That's why it's not going to be easy. This is not some weird circumstance where maybe if they're able to win the swing states and they're able to drive up turnout in some minority communities and turn out groups of voters that maybe traditionally vote in presidential elections but maybe wouldn't be too excited for the Senate races here. This is not that type of election. This election is about doing significantly better than Joe Biden would be doing in many of these states and outrunning the National Democratic Party by quite a substantial amount, especially in states like Montana, Ohio, and Texas. Because we had to jump through so many hoops and we had to go through so many different scenarios to find Democrats the winning pathway to victory, this only further exemplifies why this is going to be a very difficult and treacherous path for Democrats as they go into the next year. They will need to do everything correctly. They did it in 2022. And I think they can do it again in 2024. It also requires for the GOP to fumble quite a bit, which again, they did perfectly in 2022, and I could very well see them do it again in 2024. We will see what happens in the 2024 Senate map. Again, Republicans are the current favorites, but the pathway for Democrats, although tricky and very difficult to see happening, is still a reality and is not shut out of our future circumstance or future Congress for a variety of reasons, as I've already mentioned in this video, and ones that could populate over the next year. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.